So I have been at a conference for the last 3 days, coming in and out of it because of different church activities we had this weekend. But I've been at this church in Holyoke, the United Congregational Church there, for the Awakenings Conference. It's a conference I've gone to many years. It's every other year, and it has brings from all over theologians who are in our current time wonderful voices, powerful voices that have much to teach us. So I've come to hear Marcus Borg, John Dominic Crossan, Bishop Shelby Spong, all sorts of speakers and preachers with a lot to say to us today. And at this weekend, I especially wanted to hear Bart Ehrman, who is a New Testament theologian and teacher. He teaches a professor of religious studies at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and he's published more than 30 books, 5 of which were on the New York Times bestseller list, a specialist in New Testament, and he is an atheist. So I was particularly intrigued to hear him, and let me tell you, he absolutely got me all fired up. And some of the time I stood up and engaged him, and it was a powerful thing to be able to do that, right? Most of the time we just read people's books and we don't get to argue with them. So it was a powerful thing. But he opened up one of his talks showing us images of some of the places where the apostles go in the book of Acts. And one of them turned out to be the Areopagus. What are the chances of that? This is a scripture that doesn't come up very often in preaching. And here it is. I was going to be preaching about it this weekend, and there's Bart Ehrman putting up the Areopagus for all of us to see. And I've never seen it, so I was sort of stunned and surprised. It's a huge outcropping of white rock that's right in the middle of Athens, within sight of the Acropolis. And its name actually means Ares Rock. It's also called Mars Hill, because it's a place where supposedly, according to legend, the Greek god Ares was tried by the gods for killing Poseidon's son. So it has ancient history. And it's a place that in ancient times the Greeks used for trials around civic and criminal matters, as well as religious and philosophical debates. So it makes perfect sense that the ancient Greeks of Paul's time would have heard his teachings and said, we need to listen to this person. Let's hear more about him. Let's bring him to the Areopagus and hear what he has to say. Bart Ehrman writes that the people in Athens of that time period were polytheists, right? So they worshipped all different kind of gods, and they actually were very tolerant. It didn't matter what god you believed in because everybody followed different gods. In particular, you might have had one for the town you were in, but there was also gods for all sorts of aspects of life. So an altar to an unknown god, it was sort of like covering their bases. They were just making sure that if they forgot one, it was covered. So it meant something different when Paul saw it, because he was actually really disturbed by all the gods that they were worshiping. But he saw it as a way in. And Paul himself was a deeply educated person. He was a Roman citizen. He was probably one of the more educated apostles. And so he had read the Greek philosophers. He understood what they were thinking. And he had a way, he thought, to meet them. Here he's been sort of striking out in all these other towns he's been going to. He keeps getting thrown out. But he arrives in Athens and he realizes that maybe he has a way in. Paul says, the unknown God, that's a God I know. I can tell you about that God. That's the God of all creation. He's the greatest, and he's above all the other gods. And he decides to start to tell them the story then of Jesus, coming from God, bringing God near, right? Not so much a mystery, but instead real in flesh and bodily death and resurrection. And that a crucial path to salvation he is teaching is through the life and death of Jesus Christ. So Bart Ehrman imagines that the Athenians were pretty amused by this idea, because the Epicureans, right, it mentions in the scripture that the Epicureans and the Stoics were there listening to him. And just to take a step back for a sec, they were both, had been around for 300 or 400 years. They were different branches of philosophy that were based on teachings that essentially had to do with how to be a good person in the world and how you might live in peace. And so for the Epicureans, the greatest good came from seeking modest pleasure in order to attain a state of tranquility, freedom from fear, and absence from pain. That's not so unfamiliar to our time. But they believed that the world was sort of spontaneous and random, that a lot happened that we had no explanation, and that religion was sort of an expression of those fears. When we died, Epicureans believed that our soul went to sleep, and that was it. The Stoics, on the other hand, also were working towards self-control and fortitude as a means of overcoming the things that were destructive in our lives. It was a rational way of thinking, selfless service to others, a belief that all had the divine spark, that there was a plan for the universe. They were the ones who had the harmony of the spheres. They believed that all things worked together, and that there was something that happened when we died, that our spirit left our body which they considered to be distortion and corrupted. It was a bad influence, and actually it was a great thing to die and get released from the body and have your spirit go to higher realms of consciousness where you continued after death. So that gives you a different perspective on Stoics and Epicureans coming to hear Paul speak and saying, what is this learning? We'd like to hear more about it. But not necessarily being closed-minded, because actually they thought there were lots of gods. So they were fascinated to hear about his understanding. So many of them, as the story ends that we heard today, kind of go on, and they may have thought about what Paul said, but they were amused. They weren't sure that they bought it. Many of them just went on without it. Some of them, however, decided to continue hearing more and followed him and other apostles and ended up being part of the Christian church. Who wouldn't hear something in what Paul was teaching that would feed a need? I mean, clearly all the Greeks of that time were asking lots of questions and trying to ponder the meaning of life. And so they were actually open to the idea that God is not easily defined. Whatever it is that created everything is hard to understand. So I think that's why the Athenians sort of put him up there on the Areopagus to hear his teaching, because they also really were hungry, continued to be hungry to understand. Bart Ehrman pointed out that when he was in Athens and he stood looking up at the Areopagus, thinking of Paul standing there, speaking to a group that was interested and amused, most of whom didn't buy it, how he actually did win that day. Because over very few centuries, Christianity went on to become what is still today the largest religion in the world, the one with the most members. And actually, polytheists are very few. There are still people who believe that way, but they are not the majority. And so it's interesting to think that that day that he stood in the Areopagus led to something that has come down to us 2,000 years later. But I don't know. Do we know God any better in our time than ancient Athenians knew God? I talk to people all the time who doubt that there can really be a God. After all, look at all the terrible things that happen in our life. What kind of God doesn't interfere with those things, doesn't try to stop them from happening? What kind of God allows good people to suffer? Since the Enlightenment, which sort of was a rebirth of some of the same kinds of philosophical thinking that the ancient Greeks had, it's really hard for people to believe in things they can't see or prove. Right? We want things to be logical, rational, explainable. We want to be able to prove them through science. So how can we know that there is a God? And if there is one, how can we know something we can't see or touch that can't really be explained? Lately, I have sat with people who've told me they don't believe in God, and I've tried a different way in with them. I've said, tell me about the God you don't believe in. When they get to the end of their description, I usually find myself very authentically saying, well, you know, I don't believe in that God either. No wonder you think there is not religion for you. And I invite them instead to consider that God might not be any of the things they've heard, or any of the things they have imagined, or even who they may want God to be. Because I believe that we may box ourselves into corners we can't get out of, into a corner that God actually can't exist in, because our expectations about who God is and how God functions is so small that we end up not being able to believe in that God. That God disappoints or enrages us until we finally may dismiss that God altogether. How will we experience, then, the possibility of a God that in fact may exist? What we know, both from these scriptures and also from all the world's amazing religions and schools of thought that don't call themselves religions, right? Is that human beings don't stop questing for what is it that gives life meaning, and how did we get here, and why is all of this life continuing to unfold? Surely there must be something behind that. We don't stop dreaming of that, no matter how many different religions we try that disappoint us. And so I believe that, in fact, the way we're going to each answer that question is going to be as unique as the snowflakes that fall, or each flower that blooms, or each blade of grass. And Paul knew that. That's why he doesn't condemn his listeners in Athens. He affirms their thirst for understanding, and he speaks to them through the stories and the language they know, and the God of the unknown that they themselves named. He looks for ways to connect that are theirs already. This is a great example for us today. Our time is full of diverse teachings and understandings, and we also thirst. And I am comforted by the acknowledgement in this passage that people around the world may understand God in a way that will help me, no matter how much I may think I've got the scoop. Someone else is going to say something to me, witness to me, a testimony about their faith that's going to give me a new way in. I don't have to have it all figured out to share that I am also moved by the way the sacred happens in the world and the way I've discovered it. And then I can invite others to do that too. And then the rest is between them and God, between me and God. But this is a topic, of course, we could talk about for weeks and never finish, right? I think it's the work of a lifetime, really. And there's another perspective that I heard at the Awakenings Conference that I think has much to offer us. This was a lecture offered by Peter Rollins. He's an Irish theologian, writer, philosopher, storyteller, public speaker. And he believes that all human beings try to make God who they think God should be. The God they want, maybe, or the God they can't have, the God they reject. Many people want a God who will fix it, who will take care of bad things and make them go away, who will tell us everything is going to be all right. And instead, Peter proposes a system of thought that he calls pyrotheology, incendiary, right? A theology to burst into flame everything we think we know about understanding God. This involves a deep critique of any religious or philosophical system that promises an escape from doubt and anxiety, that promises us it will have the answers. And that is not a place that's comfortable for us. It's not. And that's why human beings often go towards schools of thought or religions that say, we can tell you exactly, black and white, this is what you need to do to be safe, this is what you need to do not to be hurt. But he says, that's not actually the God we have. And exposing that the tyranny of the pursuit of certainty and satisfaction is the way we all ought to go, that churches of the current time and future need to go. Be steadfast together in holding the suffering of this world, which is real. Holding us together, confronting our brokenness, joyfully embracing that we cannot understand the mystery of God, and yet it continues to give life in spite of everything that happens. Peter Rollins said yesterday that it is not in his mind that we find God first and figure that out and then we can love God. He says rather that we will find God by loving first. So listen to the way N.T. Wright says it. He says, the Jesus story knocks down piece by piece the kind of God we think we might want. and reveals instead a dangerous God, a submersive God, a God who comes to us as a blind beggar with wounds in his hands. A God who comes to us in wind and fire, in breath, in bread and wine, in flesh and blood. A God who says to us, "You didn't choose me, I chose you." Like Paul was trying to tell the Athenians, if we look to the teachings of Jesus, there is something different about what he came preaching than many of the other teachings around the world. Something that can grab us and hold on to us about the nature of the God that he embodied, that his ministry in the world brought us close to, that his death and resurrection invites us to even now. Jesus invited us to see God in one another and in the powerful creation that God sustains in every moment. He invited us to look especially at the ones we normally leave out. Could we see God in the poor and the powerless, the sick and the imprisoned, the ones we don't understand, the ones that don't look like us, the ones we don't agree with? Katie Stenta says that she started to realize that she only knew a white, Western, straight, able-bodied God. That the unknown God for her was the God of color, a God with different abilities who spoke different languages, a queer God, a GLBTQ God. Who else could God be? The God of the sick and the dying, the God of the agnostic and the atheist, the God of someone who believes fervently in a very different way than we do. These are all aspects of God if God created us all. And certainly a God we can get to know in our lifetime, one person at a time, one part of creation at a time, one sunrise, one sunset, new spring blossoms, new winter quiet. And we can do it together. Amen.